we're going Mhm. we're going to start by just doing a 30 minutes of just some quick lecture just to showcase the background information, going over the information itself. We're going to talk about the people, and then we're going to open the floor for people to have a Q&A, share us your thoughts, your comments, if you have questions, and if so desire, your harsh criticisms real quick. So let's start. So when we think of Asia and Asia in the 18th century, we have to think about one big word, and that's going to be trade. And in particular, it's going to be trade amongst the East and in particular to the West in terms of England, France, Italy, the Netherlands. They're always looking for a large amount of goods. And when you talk about the East, we got to take into consideration the fact that Asia in the 18th century was a multicultural, diverse, and geopolitically complex area. First of all, you got to understand that at the time, the Qing dynasty is ruling in China, and they're going to be primarily the main power of the area, quite honestly. Everything revolves around them. Japan is going through its isolationist period. It's gone through about 2 centuries of civil war called the Sengoku Jidai, and it's going to go through a period of isolation from roughly the late 16th century all the way to the 1880s, when Matthew Perry is going to arrive in Yokohama Harbor and be like, "Yo, open up the trade because of big guns." And then, meanwhile, Southeast Asia is going to be a series of kingdoms and different empires going to be revolving about trade, while the Middle East and in India in particular are going to be seeing the beginnings of European interference in their own areas, in particular India, because India is not a unified country by this point. It's divided into multiple different principalities. It's different countries or different kingdoms in particular, and we have a little bit of Dutch air control in the Pacific over there in the New Zealand area in particular. We have the beginnings of French colonialism in India, but they're going to be overshadowed by the British East India Company and then later on by the British Empire itself. It's going to be the kind of the jewel crown of their empire. But throughout it, you're going to be seeing huge amounts of trade: porcelain, tea, silk, spices, you name it. And I guess recently now we found out that there's also people, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. But before we're going to talk about Asians in Europe or North America, I just want to take a quick detour to talk about the influence of Europe and Asia, because we always talk about Asia affecting Europe, but we don't talk about Europe affecting Asia so much, at least until the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So I want to reinforce that it is a dialogue, it's a give and take. Cultures are interacting with each other, and just part of that exchange is changing ideas and fashions and knowledge. In particular, in China, we have the Yongzheng Emperor. So think like late 18th century, like 1700s. It's going to be a big fan of Europe. And to the point where part of that is having something called a tributary scroll. So imagine an official Qing bureaucracy. They have a whole scroll just dedicated to lecturing you on a variety of foreigners as they come or as they're understood in China. Case in point, there's a little expert that talks about what an Englishman or an English woman look like and how they dress. And the young emperor is going to be kind of dressing in a European style too. You can see that he's wearing sort of a tradition of breeches or pants, and he's mixing like a European neckcloth with a Chinese kind of semi-robe waistcoat kind of thing. But the hairstyle most definitively European, almost like you see in King Charles II, almost with all the curls. And we're also going to see that reflected in architecture too. The Qing dynasty is really kind of fond of Jesuits because they're going to be coming in China in the 1700s, and they're going to be sharing a lot of like skills and knowledge in terms of metallurgy, particularly in cannon foundries. The Qing dynasty is really fond of European cannons. They love them. And they're also going to be fans of architecture. And in this case, you're going to see the Haiyangtang. It's in the old Chinese summer palace. And it's this beautiful melding of European and Chinese architecture because it was built by Jesuits. And what you're going to see over there is made by Giuseppe Castiglione and Michel Benoist for the Qianlong Emperor. And if you look at the architecture itself, it's very much Baroque. symmetrical, lots of carvings. But if you look at the motifs, the curved roof, the decorations, and the water fountain, it's all Chinese. The water fountain depicts the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac, the hare, the ox, the dragon, the dog, and so forth. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the late 19th century because of the First Opium War by French and British troops. But you can still see the foundations today in the lower picture. We also see the same thing happening in India too. Europeans are going to be trying to visit India for the first time. They're going to be establishing outposts there and starting the beginnings of colonialism there. But here we have on the left the painting of Dip Chand. He's going to be depicting William Fullerton, which is a British East India Company trader, currently in the Victoria Albert Museum. But if you look at the subject, he's a Westerner, but he's been depicted in an Indian fashion. If you look at the motifs around there, how he's sitting, they all seem to indicate that he's being portrayed as Indian royalty. So here we have a British man depicted in the trappings of Indian royalty. And on the right, we have what you call a makimono, which is a painting done on Japanese silk screens. And they usually depict day-to-day life. And this one depicts a scene of a day-to-day life in Deshima Island in Nagasaki, circa the 1700s. And Deshima Island is going to be one of the only areas where foreigners are allowed in Japan. But even then, we see European influence in Japan, because look at the street lamps, look at the rain gutters and the animals present, as well as the people. We have Dutch traders, probably African enslaved people in there as well. So even though it's a Japanese painting, it still depicts Westerners. And in there too, we have Westerners influencing their surroundings in Japan. So it's very interesting that both cultures are interacting and exchanging ideas, goods, and things like that. And this map too is a little bit blurry, but you can really see the intensity of trade between India, China, Japan, and the rest of England, North America. So don't think of the ancient world as a person living and dying within a single village or town. They might not travel as much as we do today, but they'll still be part of this network of globalized trade that will allow this person, be it from the humblest worker to the highest aristocrat in England, have at least some exposure to goods as far away from Japan or India or China. So we cannot talk about Asia in this interview without talking about tea. And it's kind of unimaginable to think of British culture without tea. But one thing is for sure, you're not going to find any tea plantations in London. All this tea is coming from India and China, and it's going to be playing an enormous part of British culture. And it's going to be supplied by the British East India Company as a monopoly. And it's going to be later on exported across the world. This kind of drinking tea culture is going to be permeating all layers of society in England. And it's going to be borrowing a lot of elements from their own Asian traditions in there too. So part of that is drinking vessels, teacups and teapots, and that involves porcelain. So before porcelain was introduced in Europe in the late 1600s, most people are probably reduced to like thick, enamelware, maybe some, stoneware, thick clay stuff, pewter, brass, metal stuff. But then suddenly you see porcelain. And why such a big deal? Because it's incredibly light, to the point where some of the porcelain is almost translucent. So for somebody who's been using heavy pewterware for all their lives, suddenly seeing such a, kind of clay-like item being so light and yet strong enough that you can probably put it next to the fire to boil your water and without shattering or breaking, that's pretty cool. And it's going to be brought to England not only as part of that Asian tea culture, but it's going to also be serving as a way for Europeans to display their wealth and their sophistication. Now, when you look at this plate, you probably think it's Chinese, but this is the cool thing about it. Like I said, it's a dialogue. And one thing about dialogue is that everybody appreciates that the opportunity to make money. In this case, it is a soft-faced porcelain plate from a British manufacturer called the Bow Porcelain Factory. What is called soft paste because true porcelain is called hard paste because it's pretty dense and pretty sturdy. Soft paste is kind of done improperly. It's not using the right techniques because for decades, Europeans were trying to figure out how to make porcelain. Well, they didn't have the right minerals to do it. So to create a kind of knockoff copy, it's called soft paste porcelain. And to do so, they also copied the aesthetics of true Chinese porcelain, but they happily gave it their own twist. If you look at the decorations around it, you're never going to see like scrolls like that, in Chinese traditional art. And you're not going to see, two Chinese people like stopping in the middle of the road just to gaze upon a vase. But if you look at the detail there, guess what's written there? Bow porcelain plate. Just a little bit of selfless sense promotion, part of any kind of commercial enterprise. Can't blame them for that. And same thing here. Ever order something from Wish.com or Amazon and it doesn't quite arrive the way you expected? Same thing happens in the 18th century. It was very popular to have your porcelain set, your china set, to be custom made with your family portrait, family heraldry in there. And they would send these orders to China. And then unfortunately, these Chinese porcelain makers, they didn't know anything about European heraldry. So they would take a look at the notes or the custom order design, and they'll copy everything. And I mean everything. So if you look at this plate, you notice that they actually literally wrote the labels for each where color should be, red, green, or blue. And even then, they kind of got a little bit wrong here and there. So there you go. It's not just Europeans misunderstanding Chinese culture. It's also Chinese people misunderstanding European culture. It goes both ways. And we touched a little bit earlier on architecture in Asia, but we can also talk about architecture in Europe taking cues from Asian culture too. In this case, we're going to be studying the influence of something called Shinwasuri. It's literally taking a reinterpretation of Chinese or Asian motifs and transplanting them for a European perspective or framing. So even though they may not make sense for a Chinese culture, it makes perfect sense for a European culture, and it works from an aesthetic perspective. If you look over here, the lantern and the porcelain, it's very Chinese. The black paneling at the bottom is all lacquerware. It's all Japanese or Chinese in style. But if you look at everything else, it's all European. So it creates a very interesting blend of Asian and European perspectives into one room. Case in point two, there's Chinese wallpaper, and then this one has a creative addition too. There's a very famous sketches of birds of America done by James Audubon. And this particular wallpaper comes from a manor in England. And particularly this was Newsom House. There we go. And it was supposedly owned by the lover of the Prince of Wales. And as a gift, he decided to give his lover a bunch of Chinese wallpaper. So she decided to grab this James Audubon's, bare birds, and she pasted it on top of the Chinese wallpaper. Whether James Audubon liked it or not, we will never know. But I like to imagine he was a little bit horrified at her creativity. Same thing with textiles. Like I said before, silk is going to be common even as far back as ancient Rome. They'll be importing silk from China because it is like a luxury good. It's going to be very common. Not necessarily common like everybody's wearing it, but everybody will have at least seen it and heard of it. And depending on your social class, you might be able to not necessarily afford a whole waistcoat of Chinese silk, but maybe a smaller item like a neckcloth or a handkerchief perhaps. Same thing goes for Indian prints, in particular Indian cotton. It's going to be very common in like summer wear in particular like the southern colonies for upper class people. It's very, very fashionable. And the colors too are going to be very popular. Here we see you have a floral print. It's currently in Colin Williamsburg collections. So as you can see, it goes beyond just, kind of silk, goes into cotton as well. And it's going to spread to the lower classes as well. We have even like a labor class, like a sailor would have access to this kind of colonial trade network. And they're going to be able to sort of buy a whole silk waistcoat, but like I said, a smaller item, like a neckcloth of some kind. And in this case, is a great example of like an Indian export, like it's called bird's eye resist dyed handkerchief. And you can see that, hey, we see it today. Somebody may not be able to buy a whole Armani suit, but they might be able to buy an Armani accessory like a wallet or a belt. And it also expands to more like esoteric items too. Now, this is a great example of what you call a dragon robe, and I'm going to show the next picture because these dragon robes are explicitly for official Chinese use only. So only people who are part of the imperial court can use them. If you're not part of the imperial court, you're not allowed to. And yet here we have in the V&A Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum, a beanie coming from Italy. So kind of cut up to fit the, Western style. So they kind of got rid of the cuffs. They kind of got rid of some of the cut in the collar. And this is a full dragon robe, 4 claws. 5 claws over here in the dragon that you see over here means it's for imperial use for the emperor and his family. 4 claws probably means extended imperial family. 3 claws are imperial bureaucrats. So this is a dragon robe of somebody who's pretty high up in the hierarchy, and he has been maybe sold, maybe given as a gift, and kind of been modified to suit European tastes. So kind of this really interesting nexus of both East and West again. Same thing with furniture too. We have kind of these, reed or, beech wooden chairs made to look like bamboo, because remember, Asia is kind of seen as this exotic place. Anything that comes from Asia is seen as fashionable, different. And people love to show off that they have unique tastes. They have, cosmopolitan, they know where everything is, or they know about this far off place. Same thing with lacquerware. Like lacquerware becomes very popular, and they actually kind of copy lacquerware from Japan and China into their own Western traditions too. That's why to call something a lacquer in the Americas and England, it's called Japanning, because in Japan you really see a lot of lacquerware become of art from its own. And here we see like lacquerware kind of cabinet, truly Japanese. Everything from the motifs to the leaves are very much of a symbol, I think, of the Tokugawa shogunate. That's their mon, their symbol with the bird. But at the bottom, you see that they're like babies with like the filigree, and that's hardcore Western. So we have Japanese at the top, Western at the bottom. Really interesting mix. And like I said, Japani is going to become a very fashionable thing to have, like a style. And here we have a Western cabinet, high chest from Boston from 1700s, made to look like it's from Japan. But let's get to the meat of this presentation. Let's talk about people. Objects are easy, but how about people? Because that's something that has been kind of like the crux of my research. And thankfully, we're able to find some evidence of Asians coming all the way from China, Japan, and primarily India, all the way to Europe. There's a painting by Godfrey Kneller from 1687, currently in the British Royal Collections. It's titled The Chinese Convert. And it talks about a missionary called Michael Shen Futsung. And he comes into England as a Catholic missionary, which is already by itself very interesting. And he comes during a moment where, England was still kind of friendly towards Catholics for a really brief moment. So his visit and the fact that there's a painting of him is quite spectacular. Same thing here with Lum Kin Kwa. This is a print by Thomas Buford. And this case showcases Lum Kin Kwa. He's a Chinese trader coming to Portugal, but unfortunately he kind of gets stuck during the Lisbon earthquake. So as a kind of like a way for the British to show off, they kind of purposely go out of their way to rescue him and ship him back to China as a way to kind of stick it to the mainland Europeans to say, like, look how awesome we British people are. We're repatriating this poor foreigner. Look how cool we are. And kind of like the title card of this presentation, we have Tan Chit Kwa, and a painting by John Hamilton Mortar. And he's one of the Asians we have the most documentation about in England because he made quite a splash. He's a celebrity. He comes to England in roughly 1770 to 1771. And he's a Chinese artist making porcelain models and busts. And when he arrives, man, everybody in England just couldn't get enough of him because they could commission him to make these custom porcelain busts and models of themselves. And they were selling like hotcakes. He was charging like 10 to 15 guineas each, which is an astounding amount of money, probably like 10 to 15 times what a regular labor would make in a year. So this is a lot of money. Likewise, a lot of the artists around London are going to be amazed at him, and they're going to consider him an equal artist and intellectual, to the point where he gets invited to hang out with the academicians of the Royal Academy, some of the finest artists in England at the time, like really a who's who, like Johann Zoffany, Mortimer, Paul Sanby, and he's featured in this painting. Look at in the middle left corner, and I'm going to zoom on in so you guys can take a look. Guess who's there? Tan Shet Kwa. The fact he's kind of there a little bit indicates to me that this is probably like a last minute addition. Like they're like, oh yeah, he's here. Let's include him real quick. But hey, the fact that he got even included in this painting, I think tells me a lot of how valued he was, he was to these artists, and they wanted to include him in such kind of very, illustrious painting. It's pretty cool. Unfortunately, he didn't have like a safe trip back. He tried to hop on the boat called the Gravesend. Unfortunately, when he was the Greenville East Indiaman, so like the ship's called Greenville, but it's in Gravesend, England. Unfortunately, he falls overboard, and apparently that spooks the crew so bad that they kind of think that he's a bad luck omen and try to throw him overboard again. Thankfully, he gets the captain sees the danger and puts him on a rowboat back to England, accompanied by the ship's pilot. Unfortunately, once he lands in the local town, they think that the pilot is kidnapping Tan Shet Kwa, and they proceed to beat him up a lot. But thankfully, Tan Shet Kwa is able to calm down the situation, and eventually he takes the next boat back to China. But they note that he personally takes to English clothing to try to spook the crew less. So there you go. So things never do quite change. And then we have also a gentleman called Huang Yitong. He's going to be coming about 5 to 10 years later after Tan Shet Kwa. And he's going to be serving as a servant to the Duke of Cumberland, John Sackville. And he's going to have a painting done of him by Sir Joshua Reynolds. It's currently at Know Hall, and it dates around 1775. And in this case, it's a great example of Shinwasuri because this kid is young. He's like 19, 20. And for him to be wearing this kind of clothing, it's very formal, and it's restricted to also imperial Chinese bureaucrats only. But to do so, he needs to go through an imperial examination, and there are no records of him ever doing it. And also, he's really, really young. So odds are, John Sackville, the Duke of Dorset, probably thought, hey, this kid is pretty cool. Let's put him in this because it makes him look more exotic, and let's put him on a painting too, just to double down on that. And we also have an example of him in a sketch by Joseph Nash, and unpublished right now in Know Hall too. And I think this was a bit more interesting because I don't know if you guys can tell, he's keeping that Chinese hat called the Guan Mao, like a straw hat with silk frills on top. But looks like he's combining it with Western jackets, Western breeches, shoes, and everything. So kind of like an interesting mix there. And there's also the case of Jonathan Anthony. He's a Chinese man that comes in the late 1800s, and he's going to apply for and be granted British citizenship. So there you go. And the fact that he's also being hired as a liaison between any kind of Chinese or Indian sailor and the British Indian Company who has hired these sailors tells me that there is a decent enough sized community in there to justify hiring a dedicated liaison just for that. And here we have a sketch of him, fully westernized, Western clothing, Western haircut, and everything. It's really cool. And same thing here, servants and sailors are going to be where most of these Asians are going to be at right now. Now, we can also extend that to Indians too, coming from Bengal, Madras in particular, like Southeast Asia in particular. Imagine anything between India and Bangladesh being more or less where they're coming from. Unfortunately, because of the language, we can't tell exactly where, but based on the descriptions and how they look and how they dress, we can make pretty educated guesses. And that's going to extend to enslaved people as well. Unfortunately, it seems like the majority of Asians coming to England and North America are going to be in some way or another enslaved. We have the case of this runaway ad by in Scotland, and looking for a runaway East Indian called Caesar. And when I say East Indian, I want you to think of anybody coming from Southeast Asia or East Asia, because that's how they were called back in the 18th century. The East Indies were Asia, the West Indies were the Caribbean. And here we have a potential portrait of Caesar. we have Secretary Munro, the guy that is going to be posting this runaway ad in the Edinburgh newspaper. And you have a painting. And if you get close here, we can kind of see a man with kind of Asian features. Not confirmed that Caesar, but it very much could be him. Same thing here. We have no. I don't have a story about the servant in particular, portrayed here. We don't have a lot of documentation, but this is the Clive family, and if here we have a Indian, or in this case, Hindu female servant. It's probably one of the only images I have of female Asians in the 18th century in a Western context, at least. Same thing here, another Indian servant, and you can tell that he's retaining his kind of like full native dress as a way to reinforce kind of like that modern cosmopolitan nature or exotic nature that the gentleman is trying to portray. He's trying to showcase himself as worldly, very, kind of, and dabbling on the exotic. Same thing today, like why he might have a hookah today and a hookah in the 18th century. It's different, it's exotic. Everybody wants to show off. Now, what about Asians in North America? Well, we can document too. Oddly enough, a lot of the documentation I was able to find there around Virginia of all places. Once again, most of them, like I said, are in a condition of enslaved status. And they're going to be usually using as servants or sailors, but mostly servants. I think that's going to be probably the nature of the documentation we can have here, just runaway ads. But also too, sailors. This one is a tombstone in the Central Burying Grounds in Boston, and it's about a Chinese sailor called Chow Mandarin. So if that name wasn't enough, he's listed as a Chinese native in the tombstone itself. And apparently he died due to tragedy because he fell from the masthead of the ship Mac in Boston, roughly 1798 September. So kind of tragic, but hey, because of the accident, we were able to document Chinese people all the way to North America in the 18th century. And we can even document East Indians or Asians to the Revolution as well. There's the case of Charles Peters. He's going to be an East Indian serving the American Revolutionary War during the Charleston campaign, as a matter of fact, because he's from Madras, India. He starts off his life probably under French colonialism. Then once that like Pondicherry becomes like a British colony, he gets transported all the way to North Carolina, in particular Charleston, as a servant. And he argues that when the revolution breaks out, his master, the Tory, he should be given his freedom and allowed to join the Continental Army. That starts a whole series of court battles, and eventually the courts agree that yes, he should be given his freedom, and he joins one of the North Carolina line units. Unfortunately, he is there for the siege of Charleston. We all know how that doesn't end too well. He gets captured, and his trail kind of goes cold a little bit. We're kind of still doing some research on him. We suspect that he ends up in the Bahamas and joins a loyalist regiment there too, where he ends up dying due to a murder. But more, we'll touch on that like in the future once we have more confirmed evidence on that. And we also have East Indian serving in the British Army. For some reason, like anytime you're like a non-white minority in the British Army, they immediately either put you to take care of horses or as a musician. I got this tip from Don Haggis. Like this is like two confirmed East Indians in particular. One in the 29th Regiment as a drummer. His name is Thomas Smith. He's going to be born in 1759 in Bengal. And he's going to join until the 26th of March in 1776, shortly before they embark into the Americas. And fun fact, the 29th Regiment that he's part of is the one that's being shipped to Boston for the Boston Massacre. Now, Thomas Smith probably didn't take part in the Boston Massacre itself, but he's definitely part of the regiment, and he was in town when that happened. So pretty cool, like parallel right there. And the second East Indian to the American Revolution to the British Army is a gentleman from the, let's see here, 60th Regiment of Foot, a gentleman called Charles Bullock. He's going to be clocking in 20 years of service, probably maybe not all continuously, but he goes to the Chelsea board. So imagine like a board of people set up to discuss who's a true retiree and who's not. and he goes to the border 29th of October 1782, and he's discharged and given a pension because he's being quote unquote ruptured. And in particular, they note that he has been injured in Battle of White Plains, so kind of close to your neck of the woods. And I decided to dig it a little further through my archives and just pull something a little bit closer to you guys. And looks like oh man, this is my mistake. Sorry, I apologize for this. I found one from Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Couldn't quite find in New York itself, but they're everywhere. This one is from Anne Arundel County all the way in Maryland. So you can see we have people in New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. So all over the place. So I think I've talked enough at you. I'd rather talk with you, answer questions, have like a conversation. So please, like, feel free to shoot me questions, comments, or if you want to just talk about a particular area or document you saw earlier, we definitely can.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions for Daniel, or you could just type them in the chat. Um, I think while we're waiting for people to kind of, if anybody has any specific questions, I'll just ask you, Daniel. We talked a little bit um, before having you on here, and I think it's worth repeating again. It's a very interesting topic, very focused, and I'm sure very close to who you are and your heritage. What inspired you to kind of go on this journey that has resulted in all of this research that you're currently compiling, and where do you see yourself going from here?
I started because when I was working in Colonial Williamsburg, I was sometimes in like period costumes. So imagine like the silly clothes with the tricorn hat and everything. People would ask me like, "Are you supposed to be here?" And then I didn't have a good answer. So I started asking around other historians, looking for books, and they didn't have a good answer either. They all told me, "Hey, they might have been, they probably are, but I don't have any specific examples. We don't know for sure." So I'm like, okay. So I went ahead and started digging and kept digging. And there was very few leads here and there. But thankfully, thanks to the help of John Reese, Adam Hutchins LeClaire, Don Haggis, Keith Bissinger too, like they were able to like think about it in their own research areas and like, hey, I stumbled on this, like take a look at this. And I'm like, oh wow, this is exactly what I need, and so forth. So after like 2 or 3 years of cobbling things together, we're able to come up with something a bit more cohesive, something like this. Eventually, where I see myself going is like just kind of codifying this into maybe an actual book, so it doesn't wander off or get lost somewhere. Because this is like you said, it's pretty niche, pretty specific, but I still think it's pretty cool and pretty required for people to kind of get a more complete understanding of like the 18th century. Because I often see Asians in particular, when I talk to them, they are not engaged too much in history, especially for 18th century, because they don't think it's their history.
Hmm.
And that's the whole purpose of the research here, is to tell them like, no, like this is your history too. And there are not a lot of us around there, but like we're still there. Our story starts way earlier than the 1850s with the railroads. Like we're here since the beginning. And that's why I like about this, is because this is the ultimate experiment in democracy, the great city upon the hill, the American experiment, we the people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And when you talk about 18th century, like it's kind of like owned by, in a way, like white European Western people. Like everything was happening in the 18th century North America or Europe. But you think about when you go to, the Asian continent, and you have, China, Japan, South Korea, what makes up now the modern countries of South Korea, North Korea, those areas, there were things happening there too that I think a lot of people in the States, unless if you really kind of studied Asian history in college, or took that, like, you're not aware of this deeper history of things happening there at the same time too, and people coming this way and people going that way too.
Hmm.
Um, Sue writes, "Is there any evidence that Chinese brought fireworks to America before Europeans?" Um,
I don't have a good answer to that, but I'll try to answer it regardless. I don't think there's any evidence of Chinese people bringing fireworks before to the Americas before Europeans, because fireworks themselves, we can probably see fireworks starting as early as maybe the 17th century in Europe, like right when the Americas are being first discovered by Europeans. And because Europeans have gunpowder since the 16th century, like, so that's, even before the Americas were discovered by Europeans.
One interesting thing to note that kind of ties it in a little locally here is that New Windsor Cantonment, the last encampment of the army, one of in addition to the Temple of Virtue structure, which was a general purpose building, when the ceasefire was announced, they actually built, the Corps of Artificers came up from West Point and they built a fireworks platform, and they had a grand illumination that used specific firework sculptures of people on horseback charging towards each other, and it's very elaborate. So the concept of that, of using fireworks in a celebratory manner, at least that's being used here during the Revolutionary War, or it's just to celebrate the end of it, I guess.
Right. Like, it's pretty straightforward. If you have fireworks, if you have gunpowder, you definitely have fireworks, some capacity or another. And yeah, Jamestown, they all have matchlocks, so they probably are definitely aware of fireworks too.
Yeah. So Liz says, thank you, Daniel, Matt, and Moffat. Excellent, fascinating presentation. More and more. Keep on that trail, Daniel. Glad this will also be on YouTube. Yes, actually, before everybody leaves, I'm going to copy the library's YouTube channel in the chat. We don't have enough followers for us to have a specific URL for us yet, but feel free to like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. We have a lot of other history programs on there. We recently had somebody who gave a talk on women's literature in World War One. Now Daniel's will be on there as well, and we hope to build a broader perspective of a broader variety of history programs and other topics on there as well. So, anything else before we close for the night, Daniel? Or
No, just thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure to share my research and just, be able to, lecture. I love this. I love sharing any information to people.
well, great, Daniel. Well, again, I'll echo what Liz said. Stay on that trail, and we'll definitely have you back again for an update if you once you put that information together. This was wonderful, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Daniel, for speaking. This was a really great presentation, I think, for everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Take care now.